Good morning and welcome to the October 27th, 2022 special meeting of the City Council's Law and Regulation Committee. Call to order, and I would like our newest city attorney to, we have to do a roll call?
Yeah.
That's not silent? Okay. We'll do a roll call.
Vice Mayor Haddishelt.
Here.
And Councilmember Mendonça.
Here.
Right. And I would like our newest city attorney, Travis, to lead us in the pledge.
Ready, salute.
Pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
So you'll learn this about me, but Michelle, could you tell us a little bit about our new city attorney? All right. He was a city attorney for the city of Greenville.
Okay, so
That's all I remember.
Okay, Travis Cochran, welcome to the City Attorney's Office as a Deputy City Attorney 2. Travis was a partner with the law firm of Lozano Smith in Sacramento, and where he served as the City Attorney for the City of Greenfield and the Acting City Attorney for the City of Merced. He's been doing municipal law for about 10 years, and he joins us in our office. He will be handling the legal work for police, fire, building, and code enforcement.
That's exactly the email you sent out. Thank you. All right. Welcome aboard and thanks. I was telling Travis I once went from Monterey across the valley and ended up in Greenfield, not Ville, like I said earlier. And I have a colleague who grew up in King City, so familiar with that area. We've come to the point in the agenda where we will take public comment. All right, seeing none, we'll move on to item 5, which is the approval of the minutes of the prior meeting. And we have a memo from Assistant City Clerk Helen Dreyer and City Clerk Carmen Avalos recommending the City Council Law and Regulation Committee members approve the minutes of the September 22nd, 2022 Law and Regulation Committee meeting.
So moved.
Second.
So we have consensus to approve the minutes.
We do. We'll now move to item 6, and we'll start with, we'll take this in a reverse order. We'll start with item 6.2, our state and federal priority legislation, with our government relations administrator, Mark Walensky. And take it away, Mark.
Good morning, Chair Haddishelt and Councilmember Mendonça. Once again, I'm Mark Walensky, the Government Relations Administrator, and I'm joined this morning for today's presentation by Rob Becerra, Roseville Police Department's PIO. Our presentation this morning is an overview of priority legislation related to public safety, housing, and homelessness that were passed by the legislature and signed or vetoed by the governor. This year, 1,165 legislative bills were sent to the governor's desk, and ultimately the governor signed 997 bills into law and vetoed 168. During the course of the legislative session, more than 1,500 bills were tracked for city departments other than the utility departments. Of the bills on this list that were sent to the governor, 559 were signed into law and 55 were vetoed. The following is an overview of priority legislation related to public safety, housing, and homelessness that were once again signed or vetoed by the governor. And then I'll turn the presentation over to Rob to provide a brief overview of the public safety bills. Rob?
Thank you, Mark. And I'll continue to break down Mark's statistics a little bit more specific to public safety, which is at the start of the cycle, we identified 300 pieces of legislation that would have some potential impact of public safety. At the end of the day, at the end of the session, the governor had signed 98 of those bills into law. 20 of those we identified as, we'll call them higher priority with potential impact. And of those 20, we've pulled out 6 today just to give you a highlight on some of the things that came out of the legislature this past year. Some of them, as you'll hear, will have an impact on our police department, and some of them are really ones we pulled out just to flag kind of the trends that we're seeing coming out of the state. The first, and we listed under homeless response, but in fact, it probably could be categorized really more broadly, just across all response, and that is specifically related to stops notification by peace officers. Now, we have talked a lot about this piece of legislation over the last year, AB 2773. Because initially we were very concerned with the language that was being proposed. At the end of the day, and ultimately what the governor signed, really softened our requirements that we would need to comply with this piece of legislation, and we have some existing things in place that are going to be extremely helpful, and I'll explain what I mean. Every time a peace officer stops someone, currently today, we record a series of data points and information. That came out of a 2015 piece of legislation that passed AB 953, known as RIPA, Racial and Identifying Profiling Act. Now, because of RIPA taking place now, there was a phased implementation. Many of the things that are now going to be required in AB 2773, we already gather. Now, it is really specific to the cause of the stop. So annually, we now have to report the cause, why an officer chose to pull someone over or stop them. If it was a vehicle code violation, if it was speeding. If you recall, the initial iteration of this law was the officer, while they pulled them over, had to immediately announce, I pulled you over because of a taillight, as opposed to, in reverse, do you know why I pulled you over? So we were happy. This was a win working with our agency partners at Cal Chiefs, CPOA, to get AB 2773 more in a space that is a little more law enforcement friendly. So that is one that was signed by the governor. We're talking a lot about lately moving on to our tracking category of substance abuse and specifically related to fentanyl. And we've been talking a lot about fentanyl lately. It's been in the news. We have certainly seen an increase since the pandemic of fentanyl in our community. And we wanted to highlight AB 2365 because the state is making a pretty significant investment in an education campaign about the dangers of fentanyl. We've partnered with Placer County, and as a region, we've been doing our own education campaign. This is the state now moving forward with continued education just about the dangers of fentanyl and it being in our community. Moving on to AB 1700, we have seen a dramatic increase in online marketplace as a tool to sell stolen property. Now, this can be stolen property from one of our retailers. They walk into a Nordstrom's, someone steals, $5,000 jackets. They turn around and they have an online store where they're immediately selling those items. We also see this with person-to-person crime, where somebody steals golf clubs out of your garage, and those now then turn up online. So it's an interesting approach to try and quell some of the criminal activity that we're seeing on online marketplaces by requiring the state attorney general to basically create a reporting platform. Now, the reason that we flag this is because at the end of the day, the execution of investigating that stolen property and then trying to recover it will ultimately fall on local law enforcement because it will be reported to the Attorney General's office. There will be a flag system created internally in our investigations unit, and it will say, these 5 pieces of stolen property have been reported online from Roseville residents. Now there's reaction. So we're tracking this to see ultimately what it will look like when it's implemented, and then what resources we'll have to allocate to try and track down some of these online market marketplace sellers that are selling stolen property. Moving on to law enforcement hiring and reform, AB 1406. We wanted to highlight this because this has grabbed media attention across the country, and it is this idea of carrying a taser not on your strong arm. So if you are right-handed and you shoot with your right hand, then this law, AB 1406, requires that you, as an officer in the state, you must carry it on your left hand if you are right-handed and shoot with your right hand. Now, one of the things I will tell you is this is actually already in our policy. So there is no change specific to this legislation passing. We put this in our policy. We look back almost 6 or 7 years ago that we require officers to carry their taser on their weak arm. Moving on to AB 485 under our hate crimes criminal sentencing category. This one will have an impact on us, and we are working to figure out what's the best platform to move forward. This bill requires local law enforcement agencies to post all information related to hate crimes to that we report to the Department of Justice. We have to put that on our website now on a monthly basis. So on a monthly basis, we will have to create a new database that gets updated, that tracks and shows the hate crimes that were reported to the Department of Justice. If you ask the question of how many of our hate crime reports do we refer to the Department of Justice, I would say 99.9% of them we do. So it is something that we're going to have to come up with a mechanism on how to comply with this new law, AB 485. And then the last, and we put this on because it was an interesting piece of legislation. It is going to initiate a study that will look into sound-activated enforcement devices. So I best link this to the concept of a red light camera on an intersection. Roseville does not currently have red light cameras, but this is asking the California Highway Patrol to study the idea of a sound-activated enforcement device. One of the biggest complaints that we get into the police department are noise complaints associated with vehicles, especially if you live next to a busy intersection or a street that has a speed limit over 35 miles an hour. You hear motorcycles, you hear mufflers, you hear exhaust systems. And this is looking at trying to move into the space of being able to automatically issue someone a citation based on the decibel level of their vehicle as it passes through a certain area. Unknown if, in fact, anything will be implemented from this, but I think it's the next evolution of using technology in policing. And again, I think there's a reason Roseville does not have red light cameras. Unknown if we would recommend to move to this space for something like this, but it is something that the legislature has asked CHP to investigate. With that, those are 6 of our top 20 based on the 98 that ultimately were signed by the governor. This was, all in all, a pretty successful legislative year on behalf of the government relations team. Many of the things that we had flagged early on were lessened, lightened, and some of the language was adjusted. Nothing that passed in this cycle overly alarms the police department, but certainly there will be impacts based on the 98 pieces of legislation that were signed. With that, any questions? Or, I'm sorry, back to Mark.
Well, could let's, there might be some questions. Councilmember Mendoza?
All good stuff. Just one question on that noise study. Is that like a 1-year, 2-year pilot?
There's, they didn't put a time frame on it, but they did put, they actually identified 3 vendors that already have a product in play And so it's a pretty specific charge for the CHP, but the legislature basically wants them to come back, my guess would be within the year, to say, did they recommend it? And if so, then would there be any further legislation attached to it?
Got it. And then one other question on the online sales of stolen property. So that gets forwarded on to the AG, which is a logical progression for that. But then do they monitor it from there? I mean, what if in the course of another investigation we end up serving a warrant outside of our city, outside of our county, we recover that property? Is there another chain of events then where the AG updates that database? I mean, I could just see an opportunity where they fall behind 30, 60, 90 days of updating that, and, someone legally buys something or obtains it through the course of, a sale and another sale and acquisition. Who owns what in that process, or do we know that yet?
I think you've identified one of the challenges with this piece of legislation is, I think, well-intentioned, but when we actually see it in action, I think we would be able to hopefully answer some of those questions, or possibly not.
Yeah, I mean, my concern is, our city is more unique than other cities in our region where, we have one of the largest malls, and that does tend to be a target, and retail is over 70% of our sales tax generators. So I know that, stolen goods, especially during certain times of the year, are more problematic than others. So, I mean, this is obviously a big deal, and I think that we need to be very vigilant in making sure that, it's done properly. I don't want to, it's not ours to manage, that's AG, but I think that we certainly should be vocal about it because it does impact us more than, say, other cities. Mm-hmm. All right, thank you, good stuff.
Yeah, on 1079, the sound activated enforcement, I think that's, I was looking to see when the CHP would be reporting back to the legislature, but with our city as large as it is, there's certainly, we can't be everywhere. We've done pretty effective when we know there's a road show or a sideshow, or I'm not using the right term, but we've been effectively deterring that. But with new areas of the city, roundabouts are great places for folks to do their drifting and other things like that. So looking forward to seeing that. If I understand AB 485 correctly, this is only a hate crime that is reported to the California Department of Justice. Is it California Department of Justice? And then our obligation is just to take that information and have it posted on our website. That's the Department of, or the Police Department. Is that right?
You are correct. You are correct, and the frequency is on a monthly basis. And as a communicator, it concerns me when we have the requirement of a frequency of monthly, because now we have a deadline that we have to hit really at the end of every month to stay in compliance. So we will create that system. We will figure out, hopefully it will not be like a manual pull and a manual post, but we will comply with it. But it will be extra work for a few people in our shop.
And just looking at the definition of hate crimes, imagine political speech, if I might be not phrasing that correctly, would be exempt from that? Do you know? I mean,
I think it all depends on the context. I think it all depends on the context. Certainly, there is a lot covered under freedom of speech, but anytime our agency is called upon to investigate a hate crime, likely that report would be forwarded to the Department of Justice. So I would say we err more on the side of caution as opposed to trying to find the nuance in the investigation.
then if it's on private property,
there is still, you can absolutely, a hate crime can absolutely occur on private property. Again, depending on the context of the incident, but being on private property does not exempt from falling into a hate crime classification.
Okay. Go ahead.
Yeah, I have a follow-up question on that, actually. So, since we have to report this on a 30-day basis, I see the potential of this, these numbers being higher than legitimately what they should be. So if a report comes in, and it's flagged as a hate crime in the course of our investigation, it ends up being, disgruntled employee, marital disputes, neighborly feud, something like that, where the person who reported it felt, aggrieved enough where it was a hate crime, but after looking into it and taking feelings out of the component, really does it raise to the threshold of a hate crime? During that course of the investigation, that could take longer than 30 days sometimes, depending on where it falls on priorities and staffing and everything else. What's in place where if we're reporting this on a 30-day basis and it ends up, if it's reported as a hate crime and then it ends up not being one, do we have the opportunity to revise those numbers at the next 30-day interval?
The answer is yes, but I also think I will say, one, we live in an amazing community, and I'm happy to report that we actually have a very, very few incidents of hate crimes. And to your point, it would be reported on the initial incident, the initial report taken at the time through the investigative process. If, in fact, it was determined it was not a hate crime, then yes, the data would be updated down the line. But I see the point that you are making, which is final conclusion of the investigation, not a hate crime. Does that need to be adjusted? And the answer would be yes.
I just don't want metrics out there showing that we have a certain escalation level when in reality it's not as high as once reported. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you for that. We'll go to Mr. Walensky, and then we'll open it up for public comment. Thank you.
Thank you. So the following are several housing bills that the city supported and that were signed into law by the governor. The first bill is AB 1695, the Affordable Housing Loan and Grant Programs Adaptive Reuse. The city supported this bill, as it allows reuse projects to obtain funding for development, which creates more housing. Adaptive reuse is the process of adapting and rehabilitating underutilized or underused buildings to other purposes and can serve as a valuable tool to increase the supply of housing. AB 1978, the Department of Housing and Community Development powers. The city supported this bill for the authorization it would provide to the department and how they administer the National Housing Trust Fund, the Community Development Block Grant Program, the Home Investment Partnership Program, and the California Emergency Solution Grants Program, which provides funding to subrecipients in the continuum of care service areas, including local government entities that don't receive direct funding, who in turn select homeless service providers to receive funds. AB 2006, the Regulatory Agreement Compliance Monitoring. The city supported this bill due to the support it would provide for the construction of affordable housing. The need to increase the affordable housing supply is a crisis for the state. Streamlining the financing system for affordable housing development was implemented previously to help ensure more affordable housing projects would be constructed. The state's oversight system should be modified to be certain it's efficient and doesn't hamper the construction of affordable housing projects. Since affordable housing development frequently receives financing from more than one state entity, it leads to multiple state entities conducting duplicate and overlapping compliance monitoring. This bill requires the three main funding entities to develop a process to streamline the compliance process, thereby reducing cost and complexities for developers. With respect to housing that the city opposed and was signed into law, AB 2011, the Affordable Housing and High Road Jobs Act of 2022, the city took an opposed and less amended position on this bill because it would have required cities to ministerially approve, without condition or discretion, certain affordable housing and mixed-use housing developments in zones where office, retail, or parking are principally permitted use, regardless of any inconsistency with local government's general plan, specific plan, zoning ordinance, or regulation. Senate Bill 897, the accessory dwelling units, junior accessory dwelling units. The city took an opposed position on the bill for loss of local control and lack of transparency that would occur with the bill becoming law. A primary area of concern is the lack of transparency that would be created in a neighborhood for other property owners who would be impacted if an applicant did not have to provide written notice or post a placard that provides notice of the intended change to the lot. And then finally, AB 2097, the residential and commercial development, remodeling, renovations, and additions, parking requirements. The city opposed this bill due to the removal of a local government's ability to require parking for defined projects, regardless of the standards that have been established by the local government. AB 2097 limits the ability of local governments to take into account the unique needs of their communities by constraining when they can impose parking requirements. And then with respect to homelessness, supported and signed. AB 325, the Veterans Discharge Upgrade, as I reported to the committee previously, the city supported this bill and it's been signed by the governor due to the new opportunities it would provide to veterans in our communities to gain discharge upgrades that could allow them to gain access to benefits and programs, which may help them overcome issues of housing insecurity and homelessness. AB 988, the Mental Health 988 Suicide and Crisis Hotline. The city supported this bill for the integration and access to mental health care and or intervention the new 988 crisis hotline system would provide. There is coordination that needs to be undertaken to ensure the new system is integrated and coexists effectively with the California 911 system. However, it is expected that the new system will provide a resource to ensure that those experiencing mental health issues receive a timely and appropriate response. And then SB 872, pharmacies, mobile units. This bill will provide counties with the ability to get much-needed health services to vulnerable populations. It will allow a mobile pharmacy licensed by the Board of Pharmacy, staffed by a pharmacist, to go directly into communities, homeless encampments, and similar venues, such as transitional housing locations. And once they're there, we'll be able to see patients, provide medical exam, prescribe medication, and dispense on site. And then finally, I wanted to point out one bill that it relates to our Information Technology Department. It's a bill that the city opposed unless amended and ultimately was vetoed, and that's AB 1711, the privacy breach. This bill relates to third-party data breach notifications posted on public agency websites. The city, along with other statewide organizations, brought a series of concerns to the author and requested amendments during the legislative session. We believe that these amendments addressed our most pressing concerns, but the author was unwilling to consider the amendments and take the amendments on the bills. Ultimately, city staff from the IT department participated in a meeting with the governor's staff after the bill was passed by the legislature to request a veto by the governor, which was the action ultimately taken on the bill. And then finally, on statewide ballot measures, as you may recall, we reported on statewide ballot measures earlier in the legislative process. I wanted to report at the conclusion of the qualification process, there are 7 ballot measures qualified for the upcoming November 8 midterm election. More than half of the propositions address health and labor issues, including the establishment of reproductive freedom rights, safety oversight of dialysis clinics, and the ban on the use of flavored tobacco products. Ultimately, the 4 ballot measures that were of concern to the city did not qualify for the ballot or were withdrawn by their proponent. However, it is anticipated that the California Business Roundtable, or the CBRT, ballot measure titled the Taxpayer Protection and Government Accountability Act may qualify for the November 2024 ballot. The organization, which is comprised of major corporations across the state, if this ballot measure qualifies, it will be the biggest threat to local taxing authorities cities have ever faced. The ballot measure is the anti-local control measure. It calls for stricter rules for raising taxes, fees, assessments, and property-related fees that fund critical local services. And as we know, fiscal certainty is critical to the sustainability of local services that residents rely on. This measure would disrupt that certainty, creating new mechanisms to challenge or repeal local revenue-raising measures. This is a third attempt by special interest groups to advance this initiative. The first attempt was in 2018 when it was ultimately withdrawn from the ballot. The second attempt was this year when it failed to gain the signatures needed by the deadline. And then this attempt recently by the CRBT, who submitted nearly 1.5 million signatures recently in an effort to qualify the measure. The signature qualification process ends in early November, so we'll have more information next month on the ultimate outcome of that effort. And so in conclusion, at the beginning of the year, there were 198 bills on the city's priority list. Ultimately, 61 of the bills were sent to the governor. He signed 32 bills from the list that the city supported and 18 of the bills that the city opposed. And he vetoed six of the bills that the city supported and 5 of the bills that the city opposed. This translates into approximately a 61% alignment with the state on high priority legislation. Through our legislative efforts, we strive to find areas of alignment with the state and to remove elements of legislation that are objectionable. The Government Relations team is now beginning to prepare for the City Council's upcoming legislative platform workshop on December 21st at 4:30 p.m. here in the council chambers. The team is also preparing for the 2023 legislative and congressional sessions. And since the city will have new representation in Congress and in the state Senate and Assembly, the team will be prepared to connect with each of the new offices shortly after the elections for the purposes of developing new relationships with the new representatives and to ensure that the members, and their staff know about the city's critical issues and to establish strong lines of communications that will be fostered over the coming weeks and months. And this concludes our presentation. I'm prepared to answer any questions you might have.
Okay, Councilman Mendoza?
On SB 897, the accessory dwelling unit, so even though we oppose it, you said that that was signed by the governor, that passed?
SB 97. It's like, I'm sorry.
This is the
Yeah,
one where you knock down the garage and, is that the one, Councilman?
Yeah,
7?
897, it's accessory dwelling?
Yes, it was signed by the governor. We oppose it.
So my question is, so now the state's basically saying yes, so do we retain any local control on that? I mean, are we still able to apply our permitting standards, design, setbacks, line of sight, et cetera? So even though the state may say, yeah, the accessory dwelling is under this Senate bill allowed, are we still able, if it doesn't comply with our local standards, able to deny that, or are we basically SOL?
It narrows even further what we have as far as local control. So there still will be.
We do have some local control, though, still.
Just a
Correct,
little.
but it's very, very narrow.
So on the local control, does it allow us the ability to deny it, or would we have to just basically revise it because the state's saying that it is permitted now as a dwelling, accessory dwelling, because of this Senate bill?
You want me to answer? So with the accessory dwelling units, as long as they meet an objective design standards, then we do not have the ability to deny it.
And those standards would be our standards or state standards or a combination of both?
Yes, so there's a combination of state standards and with setbacks and things like that and height and stuff like that, and then some objective design standards that we do retain the ability, but it's very, very minimal. Very, very minimal. This is going to require probably the 4th rewrite of our accessory dwelling ordinance that we've done in the past few years. Every year you see a repeal and replace or heavily redacted revised version of the accessory dwelling ordinance come to council because the state legislature keeps passing these ADU.
So what do we do, I mean, if someone wants to erect one of these, I mean, we still have the ability, our code enforcement, to check to make sure it's done by a licensed contractor to make sure that it meets safety standards?
So they still have to pull a building permit.
They still have to pull a permit?
They still have
Okay.
to build a permit, but in order to get that building permit, they don't have to go through a discretionary process. It's an objective administrative ministerial process where as long as they meet the standards, they get the building permit.
But we still, as our city staff would still be the ones that would sign off on that permit because they pulled
That's
it through us?
correct.
So
Right,
we
the
still
bill-
have the opportunity, if it's not done right, to affect that change?
That's correct.
Okay. Wonderful. Thank you.
And just continuing on that, that would include all utilities to the accessory dwelling unit, if it's a detached accessory, because this one's a detached accessory dwelling unit.
So a JADU is actually inside the primary dwelling unit.
Yeah, that's what's strange about this bill, because it talks about the demolition of a detached garage.
Yeah.
It didn't carve it out very
This is
well.
very narrowly focused, right?
This is correct.
Yeah. And I know, having gone to see the tiny homes that, there's some folks are just putting tiny homes without, as a dry, without hooking up to utilities, so.
To hook up to utilities, because it does have to be habitable under the building code.
Right. Well, there was someone there who was really proud of not being in this particular city, but that she had the lot and she had the tiny home and
She
didn't
shed.
have any utilities, so, anyway. Couple of things. With respect to the parking, while I find that bill. Friedman's AB 2097, some homework. Can you, when we, you can provide this later on, obviously, but how many major transit stops do we have within the city?
Just the one.
Yeah, I mean, I would think
One.
that where the third track will eventually be qualifies.
Correct.
Yes, and
There's-
there
yeah,
is a
go ahead.
definition too about frequency of bus routes.
Mm-hmm.
So our third track, our Amtrak station is a major transit stop, so that meets the definition. There's also in the legislation about how frequency, but my understanding is our buses don't meet that frequency requirement.
There's a 15-minute headway or something like that?
15-minute interval.
I believe that's correct.
Okay, great. And then this is definitely a homework assignment, and this affects the city clerk's office. SB 1439 passed this year, and it changes the contribution limits. You're amazing on how much you know, right? It doesn't get put onto this report, but it would be good for not only us at Law and Reg, but all the council to know what that is, what its,
And
what
I'll
its
be-
impact is. I mean, I know it lowered the threshold, so if you were on the planning commission, you couldn't receive more than $250 or $249 without recusing yourself on a permit. I think this does the same thing, but I've only cursorily, here
I'm
we go.
working on an update to council now on that bill.
Okay. Man.
Wow, she's
All
on
right,
it.
look at us. Look at us, we're asking all the right questions.
That's why we're an example for the rest of the,
All right, we'll open this up to public comment. Other departments may comment on other departments under public? No, all right. All right, thank you very much for your report. We'll now go to environmental utilities and a priority update from Noel Maddock. I got the last name right now, I'm going to change your first name.
Good morning, Chair Haudeshelt and Councilmember Mendoza. Today, I plan to cover bills that are now law and key legislation that was actually vetoed by the governor. And additionally, I would like to provide an update on the implementation of the state's Making Water Conservation a California Way of Life. But first, I would like to provide you an end-of-session outcomes of legislation from this year. At Environmental Utilities, we identified just over 200 bills that could have an impact on the operations of the water, wastewater, recycled water, refuse, and stormwater divisions. Out of that 200 bills, there were 25 high-priority bills that we actually took positions on and actively worked on. Of those 25 bills, we supported 9 bills that made it to the governor's office, to the governor's desk, 8 of which became law, and only 1 was vetoed. We opposed 3 bills that actually made it to the governor's desk. 2 became law, and we were successful in getting a veto on 1 other. Another kind of good statistic is there were 4 bills that we were opposed to, but through the legislative process, we were able to become neutral on those. And of those 4 bills, 3 actually became law and 1 was vetoed. Next, I'll cover some bills that are currently law now, and the first one being AB 2473. Roseville supported this to help with addressing illegal dumping within the city limits. This bill increases the maximum fine for convictions of illegal dumping. And in addition to the higher fines, the person who is actually convicted will also be subject to either paying for the cleanup of their illegal dump, or they would have to clean it up themselves. The next 2 measures deal with loose and embedded batteries. In combination, these 2 bills, AB 2440 and SB 1215, overhaul the state's existing battery extended producer responsibility programs and expands the state's e-waste program. Specifically, AB 2440 sunsets 2 existing programs, the Cell Phone Recycling Act and the Rechargeable Battery Act, and creates a single EPR program for batteries within the state. Think of these are batteries that you would just buy to put into your product. It's batteries that are packed with a product but not actually installed. And then it also covers batteries that are actually installed but can be removed with just a common household tool, screwdriver or knife or something like that. Conversely, SB 1215 is dealing with the embedded batteries that are in products. And this one will cover video screens with a screen of 4 inches or larger. And then on the opposite side, the batteries are not able to be removed with a common household tool. The next few bills are dealing with PFAS, my favorite word that I always mix up, AB 652, AB 1817, and AB 2771 all deal with polyfluoroalkyl substances, of which there are thousands of chemicals that are within that class. They do not break down, and so they're actually referred to as forever chemicals. Water, wastewater, and refuse utilities are actually the passive receivers of these chemicals and products that contain these chemicals. But we're also relied upon to actually treat and remove them from the environment, which ultimately impacts the affordability of our rates. Roseville is supportive of measures that help to address the use of these forever chemicals and places the responsibility back onto the manufacturers. These 3 bills actually prohibit the use of PFAS in juvenile products, textiles, and then cosmetic products and other beauty products. So that should help to eliminate some of the issues in the future. The last 2 new bills that I will cover this morning are ones dealing with water conservation. The first one we supported, which is AB 2142. It actually reinstates the tax-exempt status of turf rebates that sunset in 2019. The exemption covers personal and corporate taxable incomes from 2021 through 2026. That's a good thing for our residents and businesses looking to convert and become a little bit more water-wise. Lastly, you've heard me talk about SB 1157 all year long. This is one of the bills that we did oppose and was signed into law by the governor. Just to kind of refresh, back in 2018, two bills were approved, AB 1668 and SB 606. Combined, they created a new water use objective for each water agency. I refer to it as a water agency will now have a water budget that we have to meet. What makes up that water budget is the aggregate residential indoor water use, the aggregate residential outdoor water use, and the aggregate commercial industrial institution use, and then water loss. If an agency does not meet our water budget, we could be subject to fines in the future. Beginning of that equation, the indoor water use, we will begin calculating that element in 2024 using 50 gallons per person daily. And then with the passage of 1157, in 2025, that will go down to 47 gallons per person daily. And then in 2030, that will go all the way down to 42 gallons per person daily. Having flexibility in all of these elements was something that was very important to Roseville. One of the trends that we've seen that affects the indoor water use is the kind of switch and trend towards remote working and teleworking. So Roseville, through our associations, was successful in getting a study on teleworking inserted into 1157 that in turn could result in a variance process to address the shift we have seen in these new working conditions. So that was a positive on 1157 passing, is that additional potential for a variance. Now moving on to bills that we were engaged on that the governor actually vetoed. The first one is AB 2247, also dealing with PFAS. It was sponsored by the California Association of Sanitation Agencies to address one of the biggest hurdles in actually tackling PFAS, and that is the lack of information known about which products are using PFAS in them. The first step to making good policy and regulatory decisions on the use of PFAS is really understanding how they are being used. This is why Roseville supported 2247, because it would have created a database for manufacturers to register their products that include intentionally added PFAS. The next measure we talked about as well a lot over the last year. This one is SB 222. If you remember, at the end of the 2021 legislative session, Roseville actually was in support of this bill, which would have created a statewide low-income water rate assistance program. Unfortunately, in the last 2 months of session this year, the author and sponsors amended the bill in ways that caused us to move to an opposed position. Our concerns were centered around potential Proposition 218 issues, as it proposed to have water agencies actually do the qualification and enrollment of people into the state's program without covering the full costs of an agency to perform the work on their behalf. Roseville, along with our statewide associations, urged the legislature to mirror the program after the LIWAP program, the Low Income Household Water and Wastewater Arrearage Payment Program, that is temporarily helping folks with the arrearages issue. They moved a little bit in that direction, which was positive, but there was still work that needed to be done. The governor actually ended up vetoing this measure, citing lower than anticipated state revenues, as well as there was no ongoing funding stream that was identified for the implementation of the bill. Lastly, I am going to cover the state's Making Water Conservation a California Way of Life. Earlier, we talked about those water budgets. Now, I would like to provide an update on the other elements of that equation. First is the water loss target. In 2015, SB 555 was signed into law, which actually required the State Water Board to establish performance standards for water losses. With the passage of AB 1668 and SB 606, this performance standard was then added into an agency's water budget. In September, the Water Board released an updated model for determining a system's water loss, and on October 19th, they actually adopted the water loss performance standards. Roseville will need to meet this standard for water loss by 2028. The next two elements are outdoor water use efficiency and the commercial, industrial, institutional performance standards. In September, DWR released a memo providing 7 recommendations to the State Water Board. The full report is still forthcoming. Now, what will happen is the State Water Board will evaluate the Department of Water Resources recommendations through a formal rulemaking process to adopt those objectives. So we will have an opportunity to participate in those processes. Water agencies, however, will begin to have to use those standards January 1st of 2024. This concludes my presentation, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Councilmember Mendoza.
Always good stuff. I look forward to your presentation and Rich Plecker, because you make really, really difficult things seem really, really easy to understand. But I do have a question on, was it AB 1157, the indoor water use? So my question is, by 2025, according to your presentation and the bill that passed, 47 gallons per capita daily, and by 2030, 42 gallons per capita daily. That's per person, right?
That is per person.
So my question is, I have a household of 4 people, two adults and 2 teenage children, who think water and electricity just grow on trees. So, I mean, we're dealing with that conservation problem at home. But how does the city know how many people are using water in my house? My question is, so 47 gallons per capita daily times 4 people is 188 gallons. So on a 30-day bill, that would be whatever it is. But during the summer months, I have family that ascends onto my house for a month or so, and that's 3 extra people in our extra bedrooms. So at 47 gallons multiplied by 7 people, that puts me at an increase of 329 gallons. So you could see in a billing cycle, if there was someone behind a desk somewhere looking at an increase from 188 to 329, it would look like I'm being rather inefficient in my water conservation duties. What is in place?
Fantastic.
How do I explain that? Is someone going to come knock on my door at the census and say, how many people are in here, and take note of that? Do I self-report? Is there some sort of a appeal process when you come knocking on my door saying, Tracy, you're using water very recklessly, because your increase has gone up month over month? What's in place for our residents, and how are we doing this as far as reporting?
So the good news is for individual residents, these are going to be aggregate. So we are not knocking on everyone's door to see exactly how many people are living in there, although obviously the population will be used in calculating how many people that we need to account for. Obviously, we can account for people coming in and visiting and things like that. But again, with what we're trying to do with that formula is there's supposed to be wiggle room within there. So while we may not meet the indoor standard, if we're meeting the outdoor standard or even less, it gets all compiled together. Or if we're doing amazingly well on water loss, that will all go into how the budget is developed. So we're not supposed to be able to be penalized based on just one element of that formula.
Okay. Because my concern was when it broke it down, per capita daily, it looks like we're getting quite granular. And there are some people that are, 2 people in a 5-bedroom home, empty nesters or whatever. So I wasn't sure if we were looking at the number of available rooms, and all of our rooftops throughout the city multiplied by this, per capita daily number, because obviously that would leave us the wiggle room you're talking about. Some people don't have full homes, some people have, full homes. And then with the prior presentation about the accessory dwellings now, we're potentially, allowing extra bedrooms and extra plumbing and could even be outside irrigation around that new dwelling as well. So I see a lot of opportunity for increased water use, and if we're basing that on the metrics of just what's built and what's available, we're not going to align. And I fear the state's going to, penalize us for that. And how do we get ahead of that?
That's a great question, and I can have a conversation with Sean Bigley, and maybe that's something that we can come back and.
I'm just curious because these numbers don't seem hard to hit, but there's so many variables, with traveling people and whatnot, and just. I have a hard time understanding how we're going to arrive at this.
Great questions. Don't give the legislature any ideas, Councilman Mendoza, okay?
That was my question, thank you.
But if I understand what you're saying, let's use an example of a city with 150,000 people. You would just multiply the 47 or the 42 times that to get your pie.
Yes.
And whoever eats the slices of the pie, right, doesn't matter, that's our budget.
Yes.
Okay.
And my follow-up on that, because I was getting to that, so that's the residential part. So commercial, I would assume, hotels and bed and breakfasts and, things like that, that's a separate metric?
It is a separate metric. The businesses are really best management practices, but then there's specifics towards their outdoor water use. So if they have lawns or anything like that within that area.
So would we be utilizing what we do for like TOT and other metrics? Would we be looking at number of available hotel rooms in the city and multiply that by this number, much like we do the number of residents by this number to give us the allotment of water for those particular structures?
You know what, that has not been determined yet. That's still something that needs to be.
I'm just curious. I'm looking
Developed
at
over
this,
the next year.
Holistically, water use. What are we doing as a city? Okay, thank you.
Okay. First of all, thank you, and I know that the city does this in their education and outreach on PFAS and PFOSs, but thanks for the examples of where those forever chemicals are. That was really good. I'm sorry, I didn't catch on Wilkes water loss.
SB 555 from 2015.
Yeah. When was that released? Was it this month?
On October 19th.
I wrote that down. Okay.
Yes.
I'm going to have more confidence in my retention. Thank you. As we appear to be heading into the 4th year of a drought, conservation is going to be incredibly important, and there's an awful lot of conversations that will go on about real-time forecasting of water supply, and I know you'll be involved in those. So any public comment on the environmental utilities report? Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. We're going to have a little Chris Romero, Amber Blix, and electric, or
Just Amber Blix today.
just an Amber Blix? Good morning.
Good morning, Vice Mayor Haudashelt, Councilmember Mendonça. Amber Blixt with Roseville Electric. Today, I wanted to give a legislative and regulatory overview of our advocacy efforts this year. Also, since we haven't had a chance to discuss it, I wanted to give a little bit of a deeper dive into the heat wave activities of last month for the committee, and then we'll go over some of the key legislation that passed and failed this year. As we all know, the legislative and regulatory advocacy is a priority for the city and the department, and our legislative platform annually guides our advocacy efforts. Next slide, please. Over 160 state and federal bills were tracked by the electric department this year, and we have dedicated resources, staff, and lobbyists to ensure our business interests are covered in the state and the federal venues, and we work closely with our trade associations, including CMUA, NCPA, and the American Public Power Association. So diving into the September heat wave recap, on August 31st, the governor issued a proclamation declaring a state of emergency related to extreme heat, increased demand, and energy supply deficiencies. There were executive orders that followed the proclamation that generally were designed to loosen restrictions on generation. And really, each of those executive orders was to get as many megawatts of electricity on the system and to ensure grid reliability. So it was really the executive orders allowed for additional flexibility throughout the week, including time of day and the length of the event in terms of how those generation resources could operate. The hottest day of the 9-day period was September 6th. That was the day where we set all kinds of heat records in the state and where we also met peak loads through many of the systems. Our previous peak load in Roseville was 355 megawatts, and that was set in June of 2017, and we exceeded that at 371 megawatts on September 6th. And just for a point of reference, 1 megawatt is enough power to power 1,000 homes. So you can see we exceeded that by 16 megawatts. Do you have a question?
Oh, wait.
Okay.
Oh, wait. Oh, wait.
The California Independent System Operator saw similar peaks. So they had their previous peak was in July of 2006 at 50,270 megawatts. They exceeded that and are now at 52,061 megawatts for all-time high. Across the West, generally, we exceeded all-time peak levels on these during this heat event. And I will say that it's important to note that those other peaks occurred in June and July, which are typically when we expect the peak load to occur. This event happened in September. So I'll talk more about that in a little bit. So on September 6th, Roseville, the Balancing Authority of Northern California, and the CalISO were all able to avoid rolling outages, but margins were very thin. And shortly in the CalISO system, shortly after 5 p.m., they entered into the first stage of Emergency Alert 3, which is the first of two stages. The second stage is actually when the CalISO would move to rolling blackouts. At 5:45 p.m., I think most of you probably got it on your cell phone. There was a wireless emergency alert. That's the first time I know of that's ever been issued for a power supply emergency like what we were having across the state. So that just goes to show how kind of concerning the situations were across the state and the CalISO. But the alert actually did work, and it resulted in about 2,400 megawatts of a load reduction within a half-hour period. And in Roseville, we also saw about a 3% reduction in demand during that time over the hour. Other bank members also saw similar reduction in demand as a result of that wireless emergency alert. And so throughout the heat wave, Roseville was working proactively with our customers in an effort to conserve energy. We asked all local schools and city facilities to increase their thermostats by 2 degrees and limit any unnecessary lighting. Our Dry Creek and Pleasant Grove wastewater treatment plants that were served by Roseville Electric went to backup generation, and that saved us approximately 122 megawatt hours of electricity from September 6th through September 9th. That's the energy component. So paired with conservation, we estimate that these efforts led to approximately a 4 to 5 megawatt reduction during peak hours, which was very important. So as I mentioned, this event occurred in September, which is not the typical time of year that you would expect these high loads. So going forward, Roseville is going to be looking closely at the month of September with a new lens in terms of planning and those kind of purposes. And also right now, in concert with our trade associations, we're going through an effort of kind of documenting how Roseville reduced demand on the system through efforts with our wastewater treatment plants to help the grid during this system. And so we're putting together, we've already sent a letter with our trade associations to the governor's office and the legislature kind of as a preliminary measure following up on the heat wave. And we as Roseville have kind of put together a bullet point of all the efforts that we took during that time to help conserve energy, help the state. We think that's going to be very important, especially in this upcoming legislative cycle, because we know, given the situation that occurred, that reliability is going to continue to be at the forefront of the legislature's mind this year for the legislative session. So following up on that, and this was all occurring actually as the legislature was ending August 31st through, the 9-day period. Moving on to some of the bills that were passed by the governor this year, we have AB 1279. This was part of the governor's 5-pillar climate plan that he released earlier in the session. This bill passed, and it requires net zero greenhouse gas emissions no later than 2045. So this bill is codifying a previous executive order on this point and making it law. It also requires 2045 anthropogenic or man-made greenhouse gas emissions to be at least 85% below 1990 levels. And it will require the state scoping plan to identify and recommend measures to achieve these goals. So going forward, utilities are going to need to consider these goals in their future planning efforts. Next slide. Another bill that passed the legislature this year that we were able to get some amendments to and kind of make it more workable was AB 2061, and this would require the California Energy Commission to have uptime record keeping and reporting standards for electric vehicle chargers, basically how they're running, if they're up, available. It applies to EV charging stations that received an incentive from a state agency, and it impacts EV chargers and charging stations installed after January 1 of 2024. Beginning January 2025, the CEC will assess the infrastructure uptime and may adopt tools to increase charging station uptime, including requirements or incentives. And they'll be defining uptime through a CEC process. So this has new requirements that could impact some of the city's charging infrastructure that received an incentive from a state agency. However, it does allow flexibility in that we can enter into an agreement with the charging provider to handle the reporting obligation for us. So that's one of the beneficial amendments that came out of the bill. AB 2700 also passed on electrification and distribution grid upgrades. This would require the state to annually gather fleet data for on-road and off-road vehicles in medium and heavy-duty sectors and share that data with the publicly owned utility to inform our grid planning efforts. We would consider the fleet data to facilitate the readiness of our distribution systems to support the state's anticipated level of electric charging. And we would need to identify our distribution investments from this bill in our integrated resource plan. So that is a new requirement of this bill, but we do think that having the additional fleet data from the state agencies may be helpful in our planning efforts. SB 1020, this is the bill that relates to the Renewable Portfolio Standard Program, the RPS, that you guys have heard us talk about for several years now. The state's current requirements before this bill had passed were a 60% RPS by 2030 and 100% by 2045. This bill sets new interim targets that are listed there that would require renewable and zero carbon resources to supply 90% of all retail sales by December 31st of 2035, 95% by the end of 2040, and 100% by December 31st, 2045. This also requires 100% of electricity procured to serve all state agencies by the end of 2035. Currently, that standard is 2045. I'm sorry, previous to this bill passing, that standard was 2045 for state agencies. And then this will have a reliability progress report developed by the end of 2023 and annually thereafter to assess these goals. We were concerned with this bill in terms of the flexibility for the out years, but the RPS generally is amended every 18 months, so we'll likely have an opportunity to readdress this bill in the future. SB 1158 is one bill that was very concerning to the department. We opposed the bill. Unfortunately, the bill did go forward, and this bill would require us to report beginning in January of 2028 each hour of electricity used to serve load and the associated greenhouse gas emissions. The one good thing that came out of the bill through some amendments is that the CEC has until July of 2024 to adopt these requirements, so we'll have some time to work through a regulatory process, and then this doesn't get implemented until 2028, so we do have some time. And this would have the CEC publish the summary of the data on their website, and then our governing board would review our annual emissions and could assess the progress towards our procurement targets. But really the concern here was the burdensome reporting requirements of every hour of generation that we use. And then finally, just a few bills that did not make it through on the legislative front this year that we opposed were AB 2133, and that would have had us reduce GHG emissions to at least 55% below 1990 levels by 2030. The current target is 40% below 1990 levels by 2030. We were concerned that this would put additional pressure on electric utilities, especially as the state's electrifying the transportation sector. And then similarly, changes to the cap and trade program that would address any allowance over allocation through SB 1391. We were concerned that this might hinder some of the allowance allocations that we receive currently, so that we worked with our trade associations to oppose both of these bills, and they ultimately failed. And then just quickly, finally, on the ongoing legislative and regulatory advocacy efforts, now that the legislative session has ended, we're still continuing to work. We're preparing a department matrix that will kind of highlight the new laws and regulatory requirements for our folks in the compliance department based on this year's legislative session. As Mark mentioned, we'll be working on our legislative platform, and then we'll also be conducting legislative planning meetings and tours with our trade associations throughout the end of the year. And then we will begin preparing for our Capitol Day advocacy efforts that will be in the first part of 2023. So with that, I'm happy to answer any questions that the committee may have.
Councilman Mendoza.
Great update, Amber, as always. You know, they tell you in public speaking to always insert or lead off with a startling statistic, you know, to keep your audience engaged. And I mean, we certainly hit that. 355 megawatts in 2017 versus 371 megawatts in 2022. That is, I'm still kind of processing that, no pun intended, in my brain. That's wow. My question is, though, you had mentioned that during that time you had asked the schools and libraries to adjust thermostats by 2 degrees, I think you said, and then we decreased our water treatment plant and went on to the generators and everything. So I'm assuming that was a level or a tier progression. How many did we have? That was probably the first one, right? How many did we have after that until we would have had needed to start reducing availability?
I don't know how thin the margins were, but I mean, I do know that obviously the conservation had a 4 to 5 megawatt impact, so that was pretty large in terms of folks responding to the request to conserve power. I do know that there was, I mean, it was a hectic week in the power industries, I think statewide, but the great news about electrons is that they kind of flow. We have a lot of these constructs and state laws that presume that electrons don't flow, but electrons flow, and so there's a way to share resources throughout the state. And so I think there was a lot of that going on, and there was actually daily calls, two calls a day with the governor's office, the Cal ISO, all kinds of participants throughout the state to to collaborate and coordinate on what the forecast looked like for the day, who was doing what, who was using backup generators. And this was, I mean, really a statewide effort. And part of the comments that we had submitted through our trade associations is that in any event in the future, that kind of collaboration with the governor's office directly needs to continue, because that was key in keeping the lights on during this 9-day event.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah, let me just pick up on the proactiveness. I mean, we got daily reports and comprehensive, and that was startling.
Yeah, it was.
You know, as we would look and realize how close we were, even in Roseville, to have something that would have been historic, I think. You know, occasionally, you know, there's a transformer that goes out because somebody hits it and we lose power, but pretty typically, you know, if lights go out in Roseville, there's something going on, right? So those updates were, you know, very good. And so is this the sort of after-action report for the entire council, or are you prepared, and I've forgotten already, a CIM for the council on this?
You know, I'm not sure what we've done at the council, but I wanted to bring it to the committee because I thought it was a very important thing and something that we were following really at all levels within the department and obviously within the city. But I wanted to bring it to the council because there was this, you know, like I said, daily governor's office calls with legislative staff and things like that. So I thought, but I think if it is something that the council is interested in, I think we could bring it to management to have it.
No, I think, you know, everyone should know, you know, this. So I'm going to walk out a little bit. You said a megawatt equals 1,000 houses, and I don't do math really well, but 371 and 1,000 houses, that would be more houses than we have in the city of Roseville, right? Right, we have 150,000 people, right? So.
Yeah, I'm not sure how many houses. It gets a little scary when policy people do math on the fly.
Council members too.
Exactly. Well, so I guess the real embedded question is, what is the average usage in a house, right? I mean, I guess I could divide 1,000 times, you know, yeah. Anyway, you can get back to me.
Yeah, no, I would just say, like, something that I was taking away from those points is we basically exceeded our previous peak by 16 megawatts, right? So if you equate, you know, 1 megawatt equals 1,000 houses, that's 16,000 houses basically of additional load that we had on the system that day. And a lot of that had to do with, you know, that it's nine days of extreme heat. We saw 116 degrees in Sacramento that day. So people are running their air conditionings more, which is to be expected, right?
Yeah. And I was feeling a little guilty and a little scared, right, that at any point that air conditioning would stop, right? And, you know, part of the conservation measure was to get the house really cold before noon, right? And get it and then try to weather through it until the sun went down, right? So.
Right. And I think this, like I said, it's something that we're going to continue to watch as we kind of have these extreme heat events that have become more often statewide and westwide, really. So.
So I apologize to the entire Roseville Electric staff who's really tried to educate me on this. So we're part of Bank, right? Cal-ISO is sort of over here, right? And PG&E is more Cal-ISO.
Yes.
But in this point, there was the interface between Cal-ISO and Bank, right?
You know,
we had to kind of help save Big Brother.
Yeah, maybe I'll turn to Sean. I'll say we are part of Bank, but the system is generally interconnected, but there's lots of nuances to that, so maybe Sean can answer that better.
Okay, thank you. You made me feel
Yeah. Sean Matcham, Assistant Director with Roseville Electric. Yeah, Vice Mayor, you're correct. So when we look at operating the grid in California, ISO operates the large part of the grid. Bank is what we're part of. A lot of coordination with Bank during what we call peak week. And so we did help out California as part of the peak period we were going through. A lot of coordination with the ISO. Our BA had daily calls with the ISO and then daily calls within the bank team to understand what we had in front of us each day and how we were prepared and how we were going to help each other.
And BANK stands for Balancing Authority of Northern California, and those are the transmission lines, am I?
No, bank is just the balancing authority itself, and it's really Roseville with its neighboring utilities, SMUD, Reading, Roseville, Trinity. I think what you're thinking about is TANK, the Transmission Agency of Northern California.
Isn't that
And-
far off? Always a consonant with me.
Right. And TANK is an important asset for many of the bank members. To blur the lines here a little, TANK gives Roseville as well as the bank members access to the Pacific Northwest for us to buy and sell power. And then during peak week, it was an important asset. So as we plan to serve the community, that we really had another straw to another market to serve this community. So that's how TANK relates to bank and bank relates to the ISO.
All right. And the real reason why I wanted to make sure I understood it, so are we, as in Roseville, a retail or a wholesale provider? 'Cause
We're
some of
both.
this
We're both.
Okay.
So as we serve
legislation deals with retail providers, right?
Right. So as we talk retail provider, that's the service that we provide to our end-use customers. So the community here in Roseville, residences, businesses, that's our retail function. And that's our priority. As we plan our utility and plan our resources, it's dedicated, the priorities to serve this community. That's our retail function. Having said that, we do participate in wholesale markets, and to the extent that we have excess capacity in our utility with our resources, we will make that capacity available through our wholesale trading and sell to the market. For example, when we help out the ISO during peak week, that us selling to the ISO any surplus capacity that we have, that's a wholesale transaction. And then in addition to that, as part of our retail function, we are active in the markets both locally and regionally, and those are wholesale transactions. So to run a utility like we do with our resources, it's really a blended function, and we look at our resources, the retail function, the wholesale function, to really optimize our portfolio to benefit the customers here and how we manage upward pressure on cost.
Thanks very much, because, our customers, whether they're business or residential, whether it's water or electric, have gotten really comfortable with the reliability, and they don't know the complexity, right, of how much it takes till that switch goes on. I'm really good at changing light bulbs, but,
Just if I may,
not so good.
if I may also, you asked questions about the usage. And so in Roseville, we have 60,000 residential customers. And so the statistic that Amber mentioned, 1 megawatt, is approximately 1,000 residential homes. That's on the high end when you look at new homes that are very efficient, maybe have solar. The number can vary depending on the time of year, the size of the home. So generally, it's up to 1,000 homes. And then you asked a question about average uses of that residential customers. Those are loosely about 700 to 750 kilowatt hours a year for a residential house here in Roseville. And then when you talk about that 1,000 homes, that's really a number that we use to say how many homes can be served at their peak usage, right? And so at the instantaneous demand. And so that's just a kind of a rule of thumb in terms of how we message some of the nomenclature in our industry.
Well, thanks very much, Sean. This demonstrates the integration between the technical side of the shop and the policy side of the shop. So thanks very much. Anything else, Councilman Mendoza? We'll open it up for public comment. No public comments. Thanks for the report, and thanks for getting us through that really scary time this year.
Hats off to your team. Very well done.
We've reached the end of our Law and Regulation Committee. There will not be a November Law and Regulation Committee, but on December 21st, we'll have our legislative platform session. So
That's correct, at 4:30 here in the council chambers.
4:30 a.m. or p.m. Because Councilman Mendoza and I are up at
Yeah, we're up
either
at
one,
4:30 if
right?
you want to join us.
Anyway, the meeting's adjourned. Thank you very much. Awesome. Thank you.